The autumn wind carried the scent of damp pine needles and decaying leaves through the small town of Cedar Falls, Oregon. It was October 15th, 1987, and Liam Morrison stood in the doorway of his sister's empty bedroom, his calloused hands gripping the wooden frame until his knuckles turned white. 3 days had passed since Ilara vanished into the ancient forest that bordered their community, and the local sheriff's department had already begun scaling back their search efforts. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, and her journal lay open on the nightstand, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. "She's just another runaway," Sheriff Davies had told him that morning, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many young people disappear into the wider world. 22 years old, free spirit like that? She probably hitched a ride to Portland or Seattle. They always come back when the money runs out. But Liam knew better. Ilara would never leave without her journal, without her grandmother's silver locket that still hung from her dresser mirror, and certainly not without saying goodbye. They'd made promises to each other after their parents died in that car accident 5 years ago, promises that meant something in a world that had taken so much from them already. The Morrison siblings had always been different as night and day. Where Liam was methodical, working at the sawmill with the same crew for the past 8 years, Ilara danced through life like smoke through trees. She painted landscapes that captured something otherworldly about the Oregon wilderness, worked part-time at the town's only bookstore, and spent her free time exploring the trails that wound through the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The locals whispered about her, not unkindly, but with that mixture of affection and wariness small towns reserve for those who don't quite fit the mold. Standing in her room now, Liam picked up the journal, his rough fingers careful with the delicate pages. Her last entry was dated October 12th, the day she disappeared. "The forest is calling again," she'd written in her flowing script. "Mrs. Whitehorse at the bookstore told me about the old Kalapuya trails, the ones the logging company tried to erase from the maps. She said her grandmother used to speak of places where the veil grows thin, where the old world touches ours. I know Liam would say it's nonsense, but there's something there, something that pulls at me like a thread connected to my chest. I'm going to find it today." The mention of Mrs. Whitehorse made Liam's jaw tighten. The elderly woman ran the dusty bookstore on Main Street, filling Ilara's head with stories about the indigenous peoples who'd lived in these forests for thousands of years before the logging industry transformed the landscape. He'd never trusted her influence on his impressionable sister, and now those stories had led Ilara into danger. Liam closed the journal and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, that steady Oregon drizzle that could last for days. He grabbed his father's old backpack from the hall closet, the one they'd used for camping trips before everything changed, and began filling it with supplies. Flashlights, rope, his hunting knife, water bottles, energy bars, and the emergency flares from his truck. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the same way they did at the mill when operating the massive saws that turned ancient trees into lumber. The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet house. It was Tom Bradley, his supervisor at the mill, his voice gruff with concern. "Liam, I heard about Ilara. The boys are organizing another search party for tomorrow morning. We'll cover the northern section near the old growth reserve." Liam thanked him, but knew he couldn't wait until morning. Every hour that passed decreased the chances of finding her safe. The police might be content with their half-hearted efforts, but he wouldn't abandon her to the wilderness. Before leaving, he stopped at the kitchen table, where a map of the local forest lay spread out, marked with red X's where the official search parties had already looked. His finger traced the areas they'd ignored, the sections deemed too remote or difficult to access. That's where Ilara would go, to the places others wouldn't think to look. She'd always been drawn to the forgotten corners of the world, the spaces between what was mapped and what was known. The logging company had been clear about which areas were off-limits, sections of old-growth forest that were protected by federal law or considered too dangerous due to unstable terrain. But Liam noticed something peculiar about the map. There were gaps in the topographical lines, places where the cartographer had simply stopped recording details, leaving blank spaces that didn't match the satellite photos he'd seen in the library. It was as if certain parts of the forest had been deliberately omitted, erased from official record. As he prepared to leave, he heard footsteps on the porch. Through the window, he saw Jake Henderson, one of the younger guys from his crew at the mill. Jake's father had been a logger for 40 years, and his family had been in Cedar Falls since the town's founding. "Liam," Jake called through the door, his voice urgent, "I need to talk to you about your sister, about where she might have gone." When Liam opened the door, Jake's face was pale despite the cold rain. "My grandfather, before he died, he used to talk about parts of the forest where people shouldn't go, places where the company found things they couldn't explain, things that made them reroute the logging roads. He said the Kalapuya knew about these places, marked them somehow. If Ilara was talking to Mrs. Whitehorse, she might have learned about them too." The revelation sent a chill down Liam's spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. He invited Jake inside, and over coffee that grew cold in their cups, Jake shared what his grandfather had told him in hushed, frightened whispers on his deathbed. Stories of survey teams that had returned from certain sections of the forest speaking in languages they didn't know, of equipment that failed in specific locations for no technical reason, of men who'd claimed to hear voices calling them deeper into the woods. The logging company had buried these reports, sealed records that should have been public, and quietly redirected their operations away from these areas. The forest at dusk was a different creature than during the day. As Liam pushed through the understory of sword ferns and salal bushes, the familiar trails he'd hiked with Ilara as children seemed to shift and change in the dying light. Jake had agreed to come with him, despite his obvious fear, bringing along his own gear and his grandfather's old compass, which he claimed was more reliable than modern equipment in certain parts of the forest. They'd decided to start their search at the coordinates Jake's grandfather had scribbled in the margins of an old logging survey, a place marked only with the cryptic note, "Do not return." The rain had stopped, but the forest dripped with retained moisture, each droplet sounding like a footstep in the gathering darkness. They'd been hiking for 2 hours, moving steadily upward along a deer trail that seemed to appear and disappear at random intervals. Liam's pragmatic mind wanted to dismiss the growing sense of unease as simple fear of the dark woods, but something about this place felt fundamentally wrong. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and scarred, survivors of fires and storms that had claimed their neighbors. No logging had touched this section in living memory. "Liam, look at this," Jake whispered, his flashlight beam illuminating strange markings on a Douglas fir that must have been 500 years old. The symbols had been carved deep into the bark, old enough that the tree had partially healed around them, creating raised scars that formed patterns neither man recognized. But beneath these ancient markings, fresher cuts had been made, and Liam's heart nearly stopped when he recognized Ilara's distinctive artistic style. She'd added her own symbols, creating a dialogue across centuries with whoever had made the original marks. They photographed the tree from multiple angles, Liam's hands shaking as he zoomed in on his sister's additions. She'd carved a date, October 11th, the day before she disappeared, and what looked like an arrow pointing deeper into the forest. Following her direction, they pushed through a particularly dense section of undergrowth and emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The space was perfectly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, and nothing grew within its bounds except moss-covered stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. The air in the clearing felt different, thicker somehow, as if it carried more weight than the atmosphere surrounding it. Jake's compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and Liam's digital watch had stopped at 7:43 p.m., though he was certain more time had passed since they'd entered the forest. In the center of the stone arrangement, they found Ilara's backpack, wet from rain but otherwise undamaged. Her sleeping bag was rolled out nearby, and her camping stove sat ready for use, as if she'd simply stepped away for a moment. Liam rushed forward, calling her name, his voice echoing strangely in the clearing, as if the sound bounced off invisible walls. He searched through her backpack, finding her wallet, her keys, even the sandwich she'd packed for lunch 3 days ago, now soggy and decomposed. But there were also things that didn't belong to her. Old photographs, black and white, showing logging crews from what must have been the 1940s or 50s. In each photo, the same clearing was visible in the background, and in each one or two men stood apart from the group, their faces blurred as if they'd moved during the exposure. Jake had been examining the stone arrangement, using his flashlight to trace the patterns. "Liam," he said, his voice tight with fear, "these aren't random. They're laid out like a map, but not of the forest as it is now. Look, this larger stone here, it could represent Devil's Peak, but these others, they show landmarks that don't exist anymore. Rivers that were diverted for logging, hills that were leveled for roads." As he spoke, he pulled out his grandfather's journal, comparing sketches the old man had made to the stone patterns. The correlation was undeniable. Among Ilara's belongings, Liam found her camera, a Polaroid she'd bought at a yard sale and treasured despite its age. The film counter showed she'd taken 12 pictures. He clicked through them, each image showing her progression deeper into the forest. The first few were typical of Ilara, artistic shots of mushrooms and fallen logs. But as he continued, the photos became stranger. Trees appeared to be bending in impossible directions, and shadows fell at angles that defied the sun's position. In the 11th photo, Ilara had captured the clearing, but it wasn't empty. Translucent figures stood among the stones, their forms human but indistinct, like double exposures. The 12th and final photo made Liam's blood run cold. It showed Ilara herself standing in the clearing, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, clearly visible despite the impossibility of it, stood their parents. Their mother's hand rested on Ilara's shoulder, their father stood slightly apart, and all three were looking directly at the camera. But their parents had been dead for 5 years, buried in Cedar Falls Cemetery after the accident that had shattered the siblings' world. Jake studied the photo over Liam's shoulder, his breathing rapid and shallow. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." My grandfather warned about this. He said there were places where time doesn't work right, where the past bleeds through. The Kalapuya knew about them, used them for vision quests. But something changed when the logging started. The balance was disrupted. But Liam couldn't leave, not without Ilara. He pocketed the photos and began searching the perimeter of the clearing, calling her name until his throat was raw. That's when they heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any animal native to Oregon. It was like singing, but in no language either man recognized, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and deeply wrong, like a favorite song played in reverse. Jake grabbed Liam's arm, trying to pull him back toward the trail, but Liam shook him off. The singing was coming from beyond the clearing, deeper in the forest, where even the deer trails ended. Against Jake's protests, Liam plunged forward, following the sound. The trees here were different, their bark smoother, their branches reaching toward each other to form a canopy so thick that no rain reached the forest floor. The ground beneath their feet was soft with centuries of undisturbed pine needles. The singing grew louder, and with it came the smell of smoke, not from a forest fire but from a campfire, mixed with something else, something medicinal and sharp. They emerged into another clearing, this one larger and occupied. A camp had been established here, but it was like no modern camp either man had seen. The shelters were traditional Kalapuya structures, carefully constructed from bent saplings and cedar bark, but they looked newly made. A fire burned in the center, and around it sat a group of people dressed in an impossible mixture of clothing from different eras. Some wore traditional native dress, others the rough clothes of 19th century loggers, and still others modern hiking gear. They all turned to look at the newcomers with eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge. Among them sat Ilara. She was changed, though Liam couldn't immediately identify how. She wore the same clothes she'd left in, her favorite green flannel and worn jeans, but she moved differently, with a grace and certainty she'd never possessed before. When she saw him, her face lit up with joy and sorrow in equal measure. "Liam," she said, and her voice carried harmonics it hadn't before, as if multiple versions of her were speaking in unison. "You found me, but you shouldn't have come. Not yet." "Till." Liam rushed toward her, but one of the figures by the fire, an elderly Native American woman in traditional dress, raised her hand, and he found himself unable to move forward, as if an invisible barrier stood between them. "Your sister has walked the old paths," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "She has seen what was, what is, and what might be. The forest claimed her as it has claimed others, those who could hear its true voice." Jake had fallen to his knees, staring at one of the figures by the fire. "Grandfather?" he whispered, and indeed the old man who smiled back at him was the spitting image of the photos Jake carried in his wallet, but as he'd been decades ago, young and strong. "I told you not to come here, boy," the figure said, but his tone was gentle. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened, some thresholds not meant to be crossed. Your sister," he continued, looking at Liam, "she had the sight. She could see the thin places where all times exist at once. The forest recognized her as one who belongs to all times, not just one." Ilara stood, moving closer to the invisible barrier that held Liam back. "I'm not lost, Liam. I'm found. I understand now why Mom and Dad appeared to me, why I've always felt pulled to these woods. Our family, we've always been connected to this place, longer than we knew. Great-grandmother, the one nobody talks about, she was Kalapuya. She married into the Morrison family, but she never forgot the old ways. The sensitivity it passes down, stronger in some than others." Liam's rational mind reeled, trying to process what he was seeing and hearing. "This isn't real," he said, his voice cracking. "You're having some kind of breakdown, hallucinations from mushrooms or something. We need to get you to a hospital." But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. Everything he was witnessing defied explanation, but it was undeniably real. The figures around the fire were solid, casting shadows, disturbing the pine needles when they moved. "Time moves differently here," Ilara explained, reaching out to touch the barrier. Where her fingers met the invisible wall, light rippled like water. "I've been here 3 days by your reckoning, but I've lived months, maybe years. I've learned so much, seen the history of this land from before the first loggers arrived, witnessed the treaties broken, the forests cleared. But I've also seen the future, Liam, possible futures where the balance is restored." The elderly woman spoke again, addressing both men. "Your sister has a choice to make, as do you. She can return to your world, but she'll never be quite the same. The knowledge she's gained, the connections she's made, they'll fade, but never fully disappear. She'll always hear the forest calling, always see the shadows of other times. Or she can stay, become a guardian of sorts, helping others who stumble into the thin places, maintaining the balance between worlds." Jake's grandfather added, "I made my choice long ago when I first found this place. I lived 2 lives, one in your world, one here, until my body in your time grew too old to maintain the connection. Now I exist only here, in the between spaces, keeping the old agreements intact. The logging company, they knew about us, about this place. That's why they redirected operations, why certain areas remain untouched. We made a deal, a treaty of sorts. They stay away, and we keep the thin places from spreading, from swallowing more of the forest." Liam felt tears streaming down his face, something he hadn't allowed himself since their parents' funeral. I can't lose you too, Ilara. I promised I'd protect you. I failed Mom and Dad. Couldn't save them from that drunk driver. I can't fail you too. His sister's expression softened, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had as a child when he'd comforted her after nightmares. You never failed anyone, Liam. The accident wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known, couldn't have stopped it. And you haven't failed me. You've been the best brother anyone could ask for, but this is my choice to make. I've found where I belong, found a purpose larger than just existing day to day in Cedar Falls. She paused, looking back at the figures around the fire, then at him again. But I won't choose yet. Not until you understand. Will you stay for a while? Learn what I've learned? The barrier will allow it if you're willing. The elderly woman nodded. 3 days in your world have passed. You have 4 more before people truly start to panic, before search parties find things they shouldn't. Stay, learn, then make your choice. Both of you. She gestured to Jake as well. Your grandfather has much to tell you, young one, about why your family really stayed in Cedar Falls all these years, about the responsibility you've inherited whether you know it or not. For 3 days, that felt like 3 months. Liam and Jake remained in the clearing that existed between times. They learned about the true history of the forest, about the Kalapuya people who had understood the thin places as sacred sites, where the spirit world touched the physical. They learned how the arrival of European settlers had disrupted the balance, how the industrial logging had nearly torn the veils completely, threatening to merge realities that were meant to remain separate. Jake's grandfather, who existed now as something between memory and spirit, taught them about the secret society of guardians that had formed, people from all backgrounds who had stumbled upon the truth and chosen to protect it. Some, like him in his younger days, lived dual lives, maintaining the fiction of normalcy while secretly working to keep the thin places stable. Others, like some of the figures around the eternal fire, had chosen to step fully into the between spaces, becoming permanent residents of a realm that existed outside normal time. Ilara showed Liam her journals, not just the one from her room, but dozens she'd filled during her time here. She documented conversations with people from across centuries, learned stories that no history book contained. She'd met their great-grandmother, the Kalapuya woman who'd married into the Morrison family, and learned about the gifts she'd passed down, the ability to sense the thin places, to hear the forest's true voice. It was a sensitivity that Liam possessed too, though he'd spent his life suppressing it, choosing the safety of rationality over the uncertainty of accepting what couldn't be explained. On the second night, as they sat around the fire that burned without consuming wood, Liam finally asked the question that had been haunting him. The photo, the last one Ilara took with Mom and Dad, were they really here? The elderly woman, who'd introduced herself as Mary Whitehorse, grandmother to the woman who ran the bookstore, nodded slowly. The thin places connect all times. Your parents, at the moment of their death, they passed through here as all souls do who have connections to the land. Your sister's presence, her awakening gifts, it allowed them to manifest long enough to be captured by the camera. They wanted her to know they were at peace, that death isn't the ending your world believes it to be. This revelation broke something in Liam, a wall he'd built around his grief. He wept openly for the first time since the accident, and Ilara held him as she had when they were children, and their roles were reversed. The fire crackled with voices from the past, and in its flames, Liam could swear he saw glimpses of their parents, smiling, whole, at peace. Jake, meanwhile, was learning about his family's true role in Cedar Falls. His grandfather explained how the Hendersons had been protectors for 3 generations, deliberately taking jobs at the logging company to steer operations away from sensitive areas. They'd fabricated equipment failures, falsified survey reports, and even started small controlled fires to create buffer zones around the thin places. It was a hereditary responsibility that Jake had unknowingly been prepared for his entire life. On the 3rd day, Mary Whitehorse taught them about the future, or rather, the possible futures that branched from every choice made in the present. She showed them visions in the smoke of the eternal fire, futures where the thin places were discovered by the wrong people, exploited, turned into tourist attractions or government research sites. They saw realities where the barriers collapsed entirely, where past, present and future merged into chaos. But they also saw futures where the balance was maintained, where the guardians succeeded in protecting the sacred sites while slowly teaching humanity to respect what it didn't understand. As the sun set on their third day in the between space, Liam and Jake knew they had to make their choice. They could return to Cedar Falls with Ilara, try to resume normal lives while knowing what they knew. They could stay and become guardians themselves, living between worlds. Or they could return alone, leaving Ilara to her chosen path, carrying the burden of knowledge and the responsibility of protection back to the ordinary world. Ilara had already made her decision. "I'm staying," she said, her voice steady and certain. "Not forever, but for now. There's so much work to do here, so much to learn and preserve. The stories, the history, the knowledge, it needs to be documented, protected. And there are others who'll stumble into the thin places, people who'll need guidance, help understanding what they've found." She looked at Liam with eyes that held centuries of wisdom, despite her 22 years. "But I won't be lost to you. The Guardians can cross over, visit the ordinary world. It won't be the same, but it doesn't have to be goodbye." Jake had decided to return, to take up his grandfather's role in the ordinary world. "Someone needs to manage things from that side," he said. "Keep the logging company in check. Watch for people who get too curious. Maintain the cover stories. My family's been doing it for generations. It's time I accepted my part in it." His grandfather smiled proudly, already beginning to fade as the connection between worlds prepared to close. That left Liam, the pragmatic skeptic who'd never believed in anything he couldn't see and touch, the protective brother who'd promised to keep Ilara safe, the grieving son who'd just learned that death wasn't the impenetrable barrier he'd believed it to be. He stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the trail that would lead him home, then at his sister standing by the eternal fire, surrounded by guardians from across time. "The choice isn't just about where you go," Mary Whitehorse said gently. "It's about who you choose to be. You can return to Cedar Falls and pretend none of this happened, though the knowledge will always haunt you. You can accept the truth and work with Jake to protect the secrets from your side of the veil. Or you can embrace what you've always suppressed, the gift your great-grandmother passed to you, and walk between worlds as your sister has chosen to do." Liam thought about his life in Cedar Falls, the routine of the sawmill, the empty house that still echoed with memories of their parents, the promises he'd made and broken. Then he thought about what he'd learned here, the vast tapestry of time and possibility, the responsibility of knowledge, the weight and wonder of truth. He looked at Ilara, saw the peace in her eyes, the purpose she'd found. He thought about their parents, existing somewhere in the between spaces, at peace, but still connected to their children. In the end, the choice was simpler than he'd expected. "I'll return," he said, and saw disappointment flicker across Ilara's face until he continued, "But not to pretend this didn't happen. I'll work with Jake, help maintain the barriers from the other side, and I'll document everything, create records that future guardians can use. Someone needs to bridge the gap between the rational world and this one, someone who understands both." Mary Whitehorse smiled. "A foot in each world, the hardest path, but perhaps the most necessary. You'll carry the heaviest burden, holding truth while speaking in lies, protecting secrets that would shatter the worldview of those you love. But you'll also be the anchor that keeps your sister connected to her time, the bridge that allows the guardians to remember their humanity." As dawn approached in the ordinary world, marking the end of their third day, the brothers prepared to leave. Ilara walked them to the edge of the first clearing, where the barrier shimmered in the early morning light. "The search parties will find you here," she said. "You'll have been lost for 6 days, suffering from exposure and dehydration. You'll recover remarkably quickly, and eventually people will stop asking questions. The story will become another Cedar Falls legend, the Morrison boys who got lost looking for their runaway sister. She handed Liam a journal, new but somehow aged, filled with her handwriting. Everything you need to know to start. The signs to watch for, the people you can trust, the places that need protection. Mrs. Whitehorse at the bookstore, she's one of us. She'll help you understand, teach you to see without looking too hard. She turned to Jake. Your grandfather left you something too. She gave him an old compass, the one his grandfather had carried. It doesn't point north. It points to the nearest thin place. Use it wisely. The brothers crossed the barrier, feeling the shift in air pressure, the sudden weight of linear time settling back onto their shoulders. When they turned back, the clearing looked ordinary, just a circle of stones in the forest, old and moss-covered and unremarkable. Ilara was gone, though Liam could swear he heard her laughter echoing through the trees. They were found 6 hours later by the search party Tom Bradley had organized, exactly where Ilara said they would be. The story they told was simple. They'd gotten lost. Liam's desperate search for his sister leading them off the marked trails. They'd found evidence that she'd been there, but no sign of where she'd gone. The authorities concluded she'd indeed run away, possibly meeting someone who'd helped her disappear. The case was quietly closed, another young person who'd chosen to vanish into the vastness of America. But Cedar Falls had always been a town of secrets, and one more didn't disturb its rhythm. Liam returned to work at the sawmill, though now he understood why certain trees were marked for preservation, why certain areas were off-limits. He began visiting Mrs. Whitehorse regularly, learning to read the signs, to recognize others who knew the truth. Jake took over his grandfather's position at the logging company, subtly guiding operations away from sensitive areas. And sometimes, on foggy mornings, when the veil grew thin, Liam would walk to the edge of the forest and find Ilara waiting for him, existing in the space between dreams and waking. They would talk about their parents, about the work of protection, about the future they were helping to preserve. She was happy, he could see that, fulfilled in a way she'd never been in the ordinary world. And slowly, Liam began to understand that keeping his promise to protect her hadn't meant keeping her safe from the forest. It had meant letting her find where she truly belonged, even if that place existed outside the boundaries of everything he'd once believed to be real. The enigma of the disappearance in the forest was never solved in any official capacity, but in the shadows of Cedar Falls, among those who knew how to look, the truth lived on. The forest kept its secrets, the thin places remained protected, and the Morrisons continued their family tradition of standing between worlds, guardians of mysteries that stretched back through time and forward into possibilities yet unborn. And in the eternal fire that burned without consuming, in the clearing that existed outside of time, Ilara Morrison worked to preserve the stories of all times, a bridge between what was, what is, and what might yet be.